morning, everyone. Today, our group will present the PINOCHET case, officially known as RV Bow Street Metropolitan Secondary Magistrate. This landmark case was decided by the House of Lords of the United Kingdom in the 1999 and is widely regarded as one of the most important cases in international criminal law. To understand the case, we must first look at the background. General Augusto Pinochet was the president and military ruler of the Chile from 1973 until 1990. He came into power through the military coup that overthrew the democratically elected government of President Salvador Allende. During his rule, numerous reports emerged alleging widespread human rights violations committed by state security forces. According to the investigation by human rights organizations, thousands of individuals were arrested, detained, were without trial, tortured, killed, and forcibly disappeared because they were perceived as political opponents of the regime. Many victims were civilians, activists, journalists, and opposition supporters. This allegation attracted international condemnation and raised serious concerns regarding accountability for human rights abuses. In 1998, after leaving office, Pinochet traveled to London for medical treatment. While he was there, Spanish Judge Balsata Garzon requested his extradition to Spain. Spain alleged that Pinochet was responsible for crimes including torture, hostage-taking, conspiracy to torture, and crimes against humanity. Spain relied to the principle of universal jurisdiction, arguing that certain international crimes are so serious that any state may prosecute them regardless of where they were committed. Following Spain's request, British authorities arrested Pinochet. However, his lawyers challenged the arrest, arguing that he enjoyed immunity as a former head of a state. As a result, the House of Lords has decided whether a former president accused of torture could be protected by immunity or whether international law requires accountability for such crimes. The decision will have major consequences for international criminal justice and the future prosecution of political leaders.
Issues before the court. The House of Lords was required to resolve several complex legal issues that lay at the intersection of international law and state sovereignty. The first issue concerned head of state immunity. Under customary international law, serving heads of state generally enjoy immunity from the jurisdiction of foreign courts. However, Pinochet was no longer the president of Chile when he was arrested. Therefore, the court had to determine whether a former head of state could continue to claim immunity for acts committed during his time in his office. The second issue was whether torture could be considered an official act of government. Immunity normally protects state officials when they perform official functions on behalf of the state. Pinochet's lawyer argued that all actions undertaken during his presidency were state acts and therefore protected by immunity. However, the opposing side argued that torture is prohibited by international law and can never be a legitimate governmental function. The court therefore had to decide whether acts of torture fall outside the protection normally granted to state officials. The third issue involved the interpretation of the United Nations Convention Against Torture. Both the United Kingdom and Chile were parties to this treaty. The convention requires states to prosecute or extradite individuals suspected of torture. The judges needed to determine whether this treaty obligation removed immunity for former heads of state accused of torture. Finally, the court examined the concept of universal jurisdiction. This principle allows national courts to prosecute certain international crimes regardless of where they occur. The judges had to decide whether torture qualified as such a crime and whether Spain's extradition request was legally valid. These legal issues were highly significant because the outcome would determine whether powerful political leaders could be held accountable for serious violation of international law after leaving office.
Argument of the parties. Both sides presented strong legal argument reflecting a conflict between traditional state immunity and modern human rights principle. Pinochet legal team argued that he was entitled to immunity as a former head of state. They maintained that all acts allegedly committed during his presidency were carried out as part of his official governmental function under international law. State officials and generally protected from foreign criminal jurisdiction for official acts performed while in the office. The defense further argued that allowing prosecution in foreign court would undermine state sovereignty and create uncertainty in international relations. They claim that each former leader could be prosecuted abroad from action taken while governing. It could expose political leaders around the world to politically motivated legal action. In contrast, Spain and supporting human rights organizations argue that torture is fundamentally different from ordinary governmental action. They emphasize that torture is prohibited under international law and is recognized as crime of universal concern. The prosecution relied heavily on the Convention Against Torture. They argued that states have a legal duty to prosecute of or extradite suspect tortures regardless of their official position. According to this argument, immunity cannot be used as a shield to avoid responsibility for international crime. Human rights advocate also stress that granting immunity would encourage impunity and deny justice to victims. They argue that international law had evolved beyond the traditional doctrine of absolute immunity and increasingly prioritized accountability for serious human rights violations. Therefore, the central conflict in this case was whether the protection of state officials should prevail over the international community commitment to punish torture and protect human rights.
Decision, legal significance and conclusion. The House of Lords ultimately ruled against Pinochet's claims of immunity for acts of torture committed after the relevant provisions of the Convention Against Torture became applicable. The judges held that torture is an international crime that cannot be regarded as a legitimate function of a head of state, since the Convention Against Torture obliges states to prosecute or extradite suspected tortures. Allowing immunity would defeat the purpose of the treaty. The court therefore concluded that former heads of state cannot rely on official capacity to escape responsibility for acts of torture. This was a groundbreaking decision because it marked one of the first times a national court allowed criminal proceedings against a former head of state for international crimes. The legal significance of the Pinochet case extends far beyond the United Kingdom and Chile. First, it established an important limitation on head of state immunity. While serving leaders may still enjoy certain protections, former leaders can be held accountable for international crimes committed during their tenure. Second, the case strengthened the principle of universal jurisdiction. It demonstrated that crimes such as torture are offences against the international community as a whole and may be prosecuted beyond national borders. Third, the decision contributed to development of international criminal justice and influenced future prosecutions of political leaders accused of genocide, war crimes, and crimes against humanity. It also reinforced the growing global belief that no individual, regardless of rank or political status, is above the law. In conclusion, the Pinochet case represents a historic shift in international law. It challenged traditional notions of immunity and emphasized accountability for serious human rights violations. The case remains a powerful symbol of the international community's commitment to justice, human rights, and the rule of law. Thank you.